Thank you. I could tell you a little bit about myself, being a former elected official, a family man, having worked in a few different fields, being a former educator, and being working these days as a professional software developer. But that's not what qualifies me uniquely among the candidates. I'm here to offer voters a serious and radical alternative to the establishment. I'm the only end the wars, bring all the troops home, cut all the overseas spending candidate. I am the only fight inflation, end the Federal Reserve, uh, sound money through monetary freedom candidate. I am the only pure pro-free markets, anti-socialism candidate. I am the only police reform, end qualified immunity, end civil asset forfeiture candidate. I am the only end the drug war, no victim, no crime candidate. I am the only uh, uh, protect your life, liberty, property above everything else candidate. I am the Libertarian candidate, the Libertarian nominee for U.S. Senate and representing the third largest party in the United States, and really the best hope that we have for breaking the two-party system, which has, I think all of us agree, brought us to a pretty bad spot in our histories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. We appreciate it. Good. Same question for Dennis Misigoy. What motivated you to enter politics and why?
Well, in terms of running for, or in terms of running for office the first time, it's actually kind of a similar story to Stephen, at a much more local level where I lived in a special taxing district down in Miami-Dade County. We had some things going on where the board that was there at the time was just pushing certain projects that were very unpopular. And again, I asked when I had the chance, what do we have as a recourse? And they said, look, it's a public office. If they won't do what you want them to do, then you support somebody else when elections come around. And if there's nobody else, then somebody's got to step up. And so I did, and I won with 63% of the vote back in 2016 to get elected there. In terms of this kind of race, though, and in politics in general, to me it's been driven by just once kind of my eyes were open and really recognizing the depth of evil of certain policies that we have and the great harm that is done to so many people. I really can't look away and kind of sit on the sidelines anymore. So it goes to that sort of oft-repeated quote, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And I always say when I repeat this, look, I don't want to be so presumptuous enough to say that I'm such a good man, but I can't sit by and do nothing. When our country has been embroiled in endless wars that kill countless innocents, our country's being bankrupt, over 30 trillion in debt, over 9% inflation, everybody's suffering a great deal unnecessarily because we have a political system that's dominated by two parties who share a view of an omnipotent government. And we need to break this cycle, and it's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen quickly, but if we don't do it and if none of us step up, then there's never going to be an opportunity for it to happen, and that's why I'm running.
Next question starts with Dennis. If elected, what do you think will be your greatest strengths and your weaknesses?
My greatest strength will definitely be my commitment to principles, my commitment to the principles of peace and individual liberty. I feel confident based on my past experience and just who I am and what my knowledge is and everything all-encompassing that I will stick by my principles, follow the examples of very few legislators in the past, somebody like a Ron Paul, who stood there even when it was unpopular, even within their own party, to stand against extremely bad policies. And I feel I can definitely bring that to the table and hopefully as well build upon that as a movement, as breaking through the two-party system, representing a third party, and again, breaking that duopoly over control in our government. In addition to that, biggest weakness, I think I might not get along with everybody quite so well. I'm not inclined to kind of gloss over these things, or I speak uncomfortable truths. I was eating dinner with family members last night and talking about, during when President Obama bombed the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. These are uncomfortable truths, or the assassination of Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, who was a 16-year-old American citizen. These are uncomfortable things for people to hear, but it's important because we need to deal with reality. And I think that might be a weakness of me, maybe making more people uncomfortable.
Time will tell. What specific skills and experience do you have that will enable you to assume your role as an elected official and hit the ground running if you are elected?
I think I've had, as modest at a level as the experience that I have in elected office is, I think it's quite transferable because it's what I expect to have happen. It's different for me as a libertarian. member of a third party, but also not just that, but having a real fundamental difference in view and policy positions to where I recognize that if I get elected, if I'm so fortunate to get elected and go to Washington, D.C., I'm going to be alone. Even if literally every other libertarian running for federal office in 2022 were to get elected, we would not have a whole lot of power there. And that was the experience I had when I served on the board of the special taxing district where I used to live. I spent the first 2 years losing every contentious vote, being outvoted by a hostile majority, 4-1 or 3-1, depending on how many people showed up to the meetings. I couldn't get anywhere. But I stuck with it. The community saw me, and they recognized what I was doing, and they appreciated it. And so when the midterms came around in 2018, a couple of people, maybe not quite totally politically aligned with me, but more people were inspired to step up, took a couple of those seats, and then we were able to make real change. We brought transparency by making meetings more accessible. We cut spending on projects that nobody wanted, and we were able to do some good things. So what I think I can transfer to that is the recognition of this is a long game. Look, change doesn't come overnight. We can't expect that I'm just going to show up in Washington D.C. want to the defense. They call it defense. I'm going to put it in quotes. Spending without any resistance, and I'm just going to have my way policy-wise. I'm going to be on an island. Even if there was a dozen of us, we'd still be on an island without any real support from the big guys. But it's how we start. We have to chip away, and I want to see Florida lead the way and set the example for the rest of the country by doing it. So I'm ready to play the long game and be patient, and do that and set the example, because I did it before locally, and I'm excited to be able to do it again if I'm given the opportunity.
With national inflation approaching 10%, how will you work to help your constituents?
I'm glad for this question, and I agree somewhat with what some of my peers over here have said. We do need to cut spending. We should cut all foreign aid as well. I mean, to any country, the American taxpayer shouldn't be on the hook for any other country's budget. But the problem is deeper than that. Okay, we have this monetary system, and what we should have learned over the last 100 years, and particularly within the last 2 or 3 years, where trillions and trillions have been printed out of thin air, is that we cannot trust the federal government or any government or their adjacent central banks with control of the money supply. Money is too important. It is 1/2 of every transaction, pretty much. And so, because it's so important, we need the best option possible. We can achieve the best options through the free market. That's part of why I want to see us both audit and end the Federal Reserve. Since the Federal Reserve came into being, the value of the U.S. dollar has declined over 94%. And certainly we've taken a big hit within the last couple of years, as we've seen, due to a lot of the spending that was done in response to COVID, not just by the federal government through stuff like the CARES Act and these PPP loans, but also the Federal Reserve itself injecting money into the system. So what we need to do is we need to get away from this system, allow alternatives, get back to the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't authorize a central bank. It doesn't authorize fiat money. It says that nothing but gold and silver to be made legal tender. I'm certainly one who's willing to take on the opportunities of as well taking on the new technologies, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, but let the market decide. Washington, D.C. doesn't know what's best for everyone. They certainly have proven that they cannot be trusted with control of the money supply. So my pitch is monetary freedom, because everybody deserves sound money. And how do we get there best? Everybody deserves a dollar that is worth as much tomorrow as it was yesterday when they earned it. They shouldn't be watching their bank account the same number, but the value has dropped, and that's what's happened over the last year, to a terrible degree. And so we need to break this cycle, but to do that, we have to break this monetary system. We have to get out of this, and that means taking drastic steps and allowing the market to work to provide us a better option.
Describe how you will interact with your counterparts in order to be most effective for your constituents. We're going to start with Dennis.
I think to paraphrase a quote from Calvin Coolidge, or maybe I'll get it right, President Calvin Coolidge, it's much more important for us to stop bad bills than it is for us to pass good ones. Because so many bad things have been passed, and so much waste, like we've talked about, but also the interventions overseas. So many bad things have been done in the name of the American people and at the expense of the American people. The most important thing I can try to do is stop that by casting a no vote, trying to amend bills where possible in order to remove some of the most onerous, problematic parts of that legislation. But in addition to that, where there is something important we can do, for example, like the War Powers Resolution that's currently going on to try to withdraw U.S. support for the Saudi coalition in the war of genocide in Yemen, like that sort of legislation, I think the way you move that sort of thing forward is you make issue-by-issue coalitions. We've seen people across the aisle between the two-party system who've made coalitions, folks like Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich back a decade or so ago, who would make a coalition on a particular issue like being anti-war, and that's what we would do. We would make coalitions by issue with everybody who's willing to step up, because there are people on both sides of that aisle, but also we want to bring in new people. We don't just want to see the red and blue teams, but we make issue-by-issue coalitions.
Okay, now this question is back at you now, Dennis. Let's talk about some previous or current politicians that you've admired, and why.
I've dropped his name a few times, but it's easy for me. It's Ron Paul, former congressman from Texas and 1988 Libertarian presidential nominee. That was the first politician I ever donated to back when he was running in the Republican primary in 2008. Even though I had sort of already soured on two-party politics, he really had the message that kind of crystallized all this for me, the recognition of government overstepping its bounds, going beyond the Constitution, violating basic human rights, and obviously the endless wars abroad, all the terrible policies. And he was a guy who, over decades and decades, having been first elected to the U.S. House in 1976 and leaving after finishing up his last term in 2012, with a little bit of a break in the middle, but for a very long time, and always stuck to his principles. And so to me, regardless of how much the rest of the world maybe came along and was able to make the change, I think it's a tremendous accomplishment to be there in, in that place of all places, and to hang on to your principles and to not be corrupted by it, but to stand on these principles of individual liberty, peace, good government, limited government. And so that would be, if I need to pick a politician, obviously I still want to kind of do my own thing, but if I'm going to pick somebody that I would admire, that is definitely the one.
If elected, what specific issues will you make your priorities, and why?
The biggest priority, and this was somewhat touched upon, we have the conflict, actually in both dueling conflicts right now, we have with Russia over Ukraine, and again, our leaders are instigating also a conflict simultaneously with China at the same time. Is absolute madness. Even if you think that the causes are justified, which I would take a little bit of issue with. The Ukrainian government banning 10 or 11 political parties, to me, doesn't really epitomize democracy. But even putting that part aside, even if you think it's completely justified, there needs to be a recognition on the limits of our power and a recognition of the real possibility of dangerous consequences. We're talking about escalating a conflict with the nation that has the next largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And then you've got another one in China also, where we're, again, pushing buttons and causing trouble, rather than seeking peaceful resolutions to these issues. It's telling that Secretary of State Blinken, the only time he's talked with his Russian counterpart, Foreign Minister Lavrov, was to try to negotiate a release of Brittany Griner. They have made a decisive effort to not try to resolve, and plenty of politicians, including our incumbent Senator Marco Rubio, has cheered on the idea. Him and folks like Hillary Clinton and Dan Crenshaw have cheered on the idea of a protracted insurgency in Ukraine to try to bleed the Russians. They don't care what it's going to cost. The sort of sarcastic way of referring to it is they want to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian. So when we talk about caring about the Ukrainian people, I don't think this is it. I think caring for the Ukrainian people is trying to end the conflict and not get more of them killed and get their country destroyed by needless warfare over things that don't need to be. There may be some legitimate issues and there's some things to work out, but that's why you have to have diplomacy. On top of that is the inflation. Again, I talked about it earlier, but Americans are suffering, and they're suffering because we have an irresponsible, destructive inflationary monetary policy pushed by the Federal Reserve to enable the reckless spending of Congress, but also to enable their own agendas. And so we need to abandon that system, and we need to allow people to explore the alternatives and break the cycle that we're in, because it's too important. It's affecting everybody, and there's no getting away from it. It benefits a few at the expense of the many.
Looking back here, what specific decisions do you feel that the incumbent senator has made over the past few years that you take real exception to, and why? Dennis?
I mean, it goes broader than one single decision. I mean, I just kind of touched upon his sort of antagonism for foreign conflict with Russia over Ukraine. As well, he was recently, I think a couple weeks ago, while around in Central Florida, you know, managed to make a statement that our military should be focused on blowing up Chinese aircraft carriers. Which, yeah, how are you going to pursue diplomacy and avoid conflict when that's the kind of rhetoric coming out of your elected officials? So to me, it goes back to the foreign policy. There's nothing that poses a bigger threat. We're less than a week away from, or less than a week past from the 21st anniversary of 9/11, where what happened? Due to our foreign policy, antagonizing and motivating people in other parts of the world to take the extraordinary steps that led to the deaths of almost 3,000 Americans, almost over 25,000 that were injured that day. One of the biggest tragedies and the deadliest terrorist attack in world history, I believe. And it happened because of irresponsible policy, antagonizing, and this sort of thing. And we need to get away from that, and we need to break that cycle, because that's what poses the biggest threat to the American people. And certainly even more so when we talk about it with countries like China and Russia, that maybe they don't necessarily have the military might to do the kind of stuff that they talk about. The warmongers and the foreign policy establishment within our country likes to beat the drum and act like, you know, Russia and China are trying to take over the world, that they have the means and the resources to do that. They don't have that. But what they do have is that if we were to go all out and try to depose them, they have nukes. They have stuff to fight back. And again, it would be the American people, the regular American people, who would suffer for the decisions of these elites, such as Marco Rubio, who again is one of these guys who's constantly beating that drum.
Governor DeSantis flying up 50 immigrants to Marthas Vineyard this week. What do you think?
So as the son of, you know, my mother being a Cuban and her family that came here pretty soon after the revolution to flee communism, to see that a bunch of people who were trying to escape that type of government, socialist government in Venezuela, that they were sent, you know, that they were basically used for this political stunt. You know, I think that's kind of embarrassing. It's kind of repulsive, and it's also a misuse of taxpayer dollars as well. You know, we can't decry and talk about waste and not talk about somebody using taxpayer funds for a political stunt. Broader than that, and again, it's just a sort of silly one-upmanship at the taxpayer's expense, while ignoring the actual core problems. When we talk about our immigration system, you know, it's not a question of enforcement or strategies or building a wall or hiring more border patrol. Our policy at its core is defective because it's based on ideas of collectivism, of you have to go and get permission, that people aren't free by their nature, rather than going back to really America's traditions prior to 100 years ago, where people came and they were able to get processed within a few hours. They weren't going through years and years. We've made it so that for many people there is no legal path, and for those where there is a legal path, it's a very arduous, difficult path unless you happen to be among the ultra-wealthy. So we reward the elites, but the regular people, what we've created is a situation where the path of least resistance is for people to circumvent the system. And we're never going to solve this problem and get control of immigration. I say get control, or get a handle on immigration, unless and until we abandon this system of centralized control and bloated bureaucracy, and instead embrace a system that treats people as individuals, and where the path of least resistance is not to circumvent the system, but for the overwhelming majority of people who aren't trying to commit violent crimes and do things of that nature, where for those people the path of least resistance is to go through properly, be documented, and go on and live like normal law-abiding citizens. I mean, I said in my opening, I am the end the Federal Reserve candidate. I've talked about that at length, and I believe in monetary freedom. You know, the gold standard, again, maybe that's the best solution. I don't know. I don't want necessarily a top-down government deciding what the answer is. I believe that the answer should come from the market. People can determine better what their needs are and what serves their needs best. So maybe it's not even going to be one thing. Maybe for certain kind of transactions, it'll be hard asset, gold and silver backed currency. Maybe for other things, it'll be cryptocurrency, Bitcoin and whatnot. So I don't know what the answer is, but the point is we need to certainly get away from the fiat money of the Federal Reserve that has been printing and devaluing the dollar for more than a century at this point. So that's an easy one for me. Thank you guys again for giving us the forum and the opportunity here to be able to speak to voters in this format. And I want to applaud my peers over here. Even where we have disagreements, we all recognize that one of the biggest problems, and I think most Americans today recognize that at the core of a lot of our problems is the two-party system and what it has done. One thing that's different about me is being a candidate from the third largest party in the country is that a win for me would represent something fundamentally different. Not just another independent who's going to caucus one way or the other, and maybe do a couple things a little different on the edges or tinker around the edges in terms of policy. I represent a radical, different change to a commitment to individual liberty, to peace, to non-interventionism, to the idea of that the role of government is strictly to preserve or to protect the individual rights to life, liberty, and property. That's it. All of this sort of meddling and spending and redistribution of wealth and everything else that's gone on is outside of the bounds, and we need to get to that. And it's not going to happen overnight. This is a long game, but how much longer can we wait? And that's one of my taglines. Is change cannot wait. We cannot wait any longer. We're $30 trillion in debt, inflation above 9%, and our leaders are, as I say, escalating conflicts with two other nuclear-armed powers simultaneously. We can't afford to allow them to continue on any longer. We have to begin the process of change. That's what my candidacy represents. Again, my name is Dennis Misigoy. Check out the website. They'll have the link, but misigoy.com. Look at more of the issues because we didn't really get into. There's so much more we can get into and so much more we can talk about. But thank you guys again.